What are your thoughts on yet another wave of COVID and how countries around the world are responding, specifically China? I mean, vaccines were expected to help, and of course, they've given us more safety. But at the same time, it's not stopping some countries, like China, from locking down.
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that. Out of endless uncertainties going into the turn of the year, this is probably the one, if not the biggest, it's the one that we're all most aware of, but yet we know so little. I think on the specific of your question about China, as with a number of other issues about China, for the first time in over 30 years of following the country closely, I'm not sure if their strategy is right. This particular latest variant, Omicron, of course, is spreading so easily. We have nearly 200,000 cases here in the UK as of yesterday, which is huge. France even more. And so if it's in China, then without severe lockdowns, they're not going to be able to stop it from spreading. And the same approach, which is rather encouraging, having just caught what Dr. Fauci said, the same approach today to what was applied in Wuhan 21 months ago just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. And given that China has already got challenges with its cyclical growth and its structural growth, I would have thought the Chinese have to possibly rethink, but it looks like a leadership that doesn't like to rethink, at least publicly, too much. But it can only clearly harm Chinese growth itself and China's important marginal impact on world growth, especially with supply chains, as you featured.
Yeah, and COVID has also made a mess out of inflation expectations, Jim. There are different narratives out there. Some who say it is transitory. This will pass once we hit the first quarter. Others say that this recent wave of Omicron, while yes, less severe, still highly transmissible, will have an effect on growth and therefore accentuate also the supply chain issues that we've seen play out this quarter.
Yeah. I'm sort of open-minded. It seemed to me a year ago that the big concern later last year, or what is now this year still, would be that growth would recover sharply and we would have some fears about inflation. And of course, that's exactly what's going on. But now that we're in this position, it's not obvious to me that we have necessarily got a permanent rise in inflation. Some important measures of inflation expectations, notably in the US. I always follow the University of Michigan long-term one very closely. They're quite stable. And the markets don't show signs of being overly worried about it, which doesn't necessarily mean anything, but of course, sometimes it does. So I think that my dreadful answer is I think we'll just have to wait and see. But I can also at the same time see why there are some grounds for worrying about inflation. We have an extremely accommodative monetary policy everywhere. Fiscal policy has been hugely expansive. And of course, we have supply chain disruptions and wages are picking up in some places. And indeed, linked to the complications of current life, almost deliberately in many countries as a result of government policies to try and reduce income inequality, which socially and for the long-term benefit of the capitalist system is probably necessary, but it could add to inflationary pressures.
So what I'm hearing from you is you say inflationary pressures will exist into 2021, as will the ongoing supply chain shortage. Jim, what does that mean for big tech? Because here in the U.S., some of the biggest technology companies are sitting on big gains for this year. Valuations have come into the conversation, but if the supply chain shortage continues, does that put more pressure on some of the biggest semiconductor companies out there?
The way that big tech has just sort of thrown off repeated challenges, and maybe because it can thrive in so many environments, particularly one of COVID existing, raises the possibility that perhaps the ongoing surprise is that they just continue to do so well. I suspect at the end of the day, something rather basic is going to be important ultimately. And that is the stance of monetary policy. We've seen episodes over the past 15 months, really, where where the markets start to fear about higher bond yields and a much more aggressive monetary policy. And the tech sector tends to lose out relative to cyclicals and financials. So if inflation does rise, and more importantly, if inflation expectations start to rise sharply and central banks start to panic, I would have guessed, famous last words, I would have guessed that tech will go through a tough time. But as we see, as evidenced by this call we're having on Zoom, I mean, technology is keeping the world moving around as well as possible, despite this staggering disruption to our lives.
It benefits from stay at home and benefits from the reopening. Set the scene for us, Jim. 2022, biggest story in Europe?
You know, we've got some further important elections in Europe coming up, and there's a number of issues that are always there persistently in Europe. France, in particular, that often likes to see itself as the leader of the EU and the Euro area, and Macron so ambitious in this area. Will he manage to get a second term? And given that we have Germany that's moving away from Merkel, does this mean a more, let's call it, move towards the United States of Europe? And in addition, you've got the whole issue of the Italian presidency and whether Draghi can continue this remarkably, by Italian standards, successful brief period of being the prime minister. All these things are always there, on top of everything to do with Omicron and COVID and inflation and et cetera, et cetera. So huge number of uncertainties. But if we were to work on the naive assumption that Omicron, perhaps naive, that Omicron, whilst it's spreading faster, is much weaker than the previous variants, it's not impossible that we are in the early stages of finally shifting this to being an endemic health challenge rather than a pandemic, in which case the European economies will come roaring back because European policymakers have tightened up recently. And it's not impossible by the end of January, we're talking about some kind of accelerating boom again, at least in the economic cycle.